So over the last week or two, we have seen videos of long queues for fuel by Russian motorists across the country and including occupied Crimea. So what does all this mean? Is it a harbinger of a really dark and cold winter for the population ruled from Moscow? And what will be the effects of this on the Russo-Ukrainian war and the general economic situation in Russia? Привit, and welcome to Geopolitics from Ukraine with me, Connor Klein. I'm here in Odessa, on the shores of the Black Sea, in free Ukraine, not in the occupied part that is across the Black Sea in Crimea. And I'm here to give you a more nuanced and informed opinion about what is happening in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So what we have seen over the last few weeks is something I've been talking about for over a year since I started the second Geopolitics channel. That is that the Russian economy, along with needing to find solutions to their manpower shortage and their material shortage, we're going to hit a crunch in the second half of 2025. Basically, Russia needs to solve issues for money, material, and manpower, and they're all interconnected to a certain extent, and the money part is now really starting to become a crunch issue. Now, this does not mean that the Russian economy is about to collapse tomorrow. However, these fuel shortages that have led to a little bit of panic, it seems panic buying across Russia, are likely only to get worse. First reason for that is the Ukrainian military has been targeting for about over a month much of the Russian capacity to process, say, diesel and other fuels across the country, along with their oil refineries, and this is creating a major issue in terms of the revenues that Russia gets from selling those products and also just their domestic supply. And as we head into the winter of 2025 and 2026, we have seen in previous winters a little bit of an issue in terms of heating supplies in certain parts of Russia. Nothing massive as a consequence. It was a little bit worse last winter, but this winter, it looks like they are really going to be in danger of many parts of the country having serious issues with fuel, whether that's for heating or for their ability to drive around. Apparently in Crimea, the number of cars on the roads has dropped precipitously in the last week or so because they're just simply running out of fuel. They need fuel also for the war effort. War is extremely expensive as an endeavor. You really need to be winning and winning big to make it worthwhile economically. And Russia, as you've seen over the last 2 years in particular, has gained 1 percentage point of Ukrainian territory and basically wrecked all that territory in the process. And they definitely have not been getting much of a return on their investment. It might look great on the balance sheets, or the bookkeeping to say that you built a new tank and it's worth, let's just say, $1 million US dollars. But if it gets blown up in Ukraine 3 weeks later by an FPV drone, then with the crew inside it, with those people, that human capital, then it was a huge net loss in reality that at some point is going to become evident. So the Russian economy, how does it look going into this winter? Well, they are in effect in recession already. The official statistics are claiming they have a tiny bit of growth, but it's not really that credible because it's based on what the Russian government wants you to hear, and in a lot of parts their own information space is basically saying there's no economic growth. In reality, it's almost certainly a minus at this point, and they've had that for definitely for 2 quarters, so they're going to be technically in a recession. They won't announce that, but that is what is happening. Let's look at the interest rates, some other key indicators. That is at 21%, but inflation is at least at 10% in Russia. So inflation is 10%, not quite hyperinflation obviously, but it is significant, and the interest rates are already very, very high. So if they were to drop the interest rates to try and boost the economy, if the economy is stagnant, then inflation would increase dramatically again. So they're kind of caught in terms of the policy tools that they have to correct that. Many businesses are in great difficulty in Russia. There's also a big issue with companies needing liquidity. Russia itself has run down its own slush fund. The liquid assets that are estimated have been reduced from about 140 billion back in 2022 when they started this invasion. Now they're down to 40 billion, so you can see it's been depleted quite rapidly, and that would indicate if they continue in that vein, they'd only be able to have at least a liquid part of it for another year and a third. So, and maybe they would even need to accelerate that. They have a huge budget deficit. I think at the moment it's running at over 20%. They need to find the money. Either they're going to have to slash a lot of the expenditure going into 2026. which means public services, or they would need to borrow, but that's going to be very difficult for the Russian government to do. Maybe they could get from China, but then of course that will come with some big quid pro quo. Their main exports, they're selling them at a huge discount, as we know, which is basically selling resources to China and to India in particular. So all in all, their economy is in really big, dire straits. China may decide to bail them out. That might be their solution. However, that will come with a huge pound of flesh, metaphorically speaking, because, well, China is not going to bail them out unless they get a huge benefit out of it, which probably means taking something substantial in the long term from Russia. So basically, the Russian economy is in huge problems. How does this affect the war effort? Well, wars are expensive. You need the resources. Ukraine also has a bit of a budget crunch. They need to find financing, about 50% of the financing for next year yet. Where they will get it from, possibly from the Russian frozen assets that are held in Belgium. There's over 100 billion euros worth, so I guess it's like over 120 billion US dollars worth, and that would definitely, if it were to be released to Ukraine in some shape or form, then that would allow the Ukrainian government to bankroll itself for at least another 2 or 3 years, and that would probably, presumably, buy them enough breathing space to come to a successful outcome in the war. Russia, on the other hand, really struggling to with its manpower recruitment. There's a lot of contradictory reports about how many soldiers they're actually able to recruit at the moment. The most reliable estimates say that it has dropped quite a bit, that less than half of it was last year on month. And one of the big ways that the main way that they incentivize Russian men to sign up is through huge salaries. Again, if you're running out of money, then you will not be able to afford those high salaries to continue to encourage people to join. You would probably have to keep pushing them up. The solution to that would be to go for another mobilization. However, that could be politically destabilizing for Vladimir Putin and his grip and power in Moscow. He did do a partial mobilization back in the autumn of 2022. It was extremely unpopular, and it's estimated about 1 million mainly Russian men left the country. They tend to be better educated, more productive, so it has huge consequences if they were to go to another mobilization. They are trying to take some interim measures now they're going to change the law, from what I read, about the annual conscription is twice a year, where Russian men serve internally, not for fighting in this war, but internally, and then many of them are signed up after they end their compulsory mobilization as a conscript in Russia. They sign up for the full war to go and fight in Ukraine. However, that law is going to be changed. That will be continuous in terms of the call-up, so probably they're going to dramatically increase that as an interim measure. So what we're seeing is that the Russian war effort is starting to come to a really difficult impasse, and early in 2026, presumably Russia is going to have to make a lot of difficult decisions. The leadership, one option could be go solve the manpower crisis with mobilization. Again, going to be very, very unpopular if there's a general mobilization across the country. Will now then affect possibly the elites. Well, Russia is so corrupt that presumably the elites would pay their way out, but people in Moscow and St. Petersburg would then be going to the military fighting war. Very few people from Moscow and St. Petersburg have fought in this war in general. It's only a tiny percentage of the Russian military. However, if you were to have general mobilization, that could be, again, very, very threatening to the grip on power that Vladimir Putin has. On top of that, we are going to see that they are going to have to make huge budget cuts. Taxes have also been going up. I forgot to mention that. They're now going to raise VAT in general from 20 to 22%. And probably other taxes are going to increase. I think that I read that if you import cars now, there's going to be some special scrapping of the vehicle tax on certain types of cars that come in, and that's going to bump up the price by another 20 or 30%. It just seems like they're trying to introduce new taxes that are going to be a little bit more less obvious for the public in the beginning, but again, that will push up prices, so you're going to see inflation, and the tax burden will increase, presumably on the middle classes in Russia, which is pretty much the same everywhere. The middle classes bear the brunt of taxation in general, while the rich elite presumably will have some ways to, in general, get out of that. So that is what we will see. Russia has also changed its tactics as a result of not having the resources and the capacity to build new vehicles at a fast enough rate. So Russia cannot produce enough tanks and armored vehicles to sustain their loss rate, or at least the tactics they were using in 2022, 2023, and 2024. Now they have switched. They use primarily infantry. They use, if you look at the loss rates of Russian tanks and armored vehicles, they have dropped quite a lot. They basically do not use them. And that is because they have hit a limit on what they can refurbish from Soviet stocks. They used all the best stuff already, and they would be in huge risk if they continue to burn through all their stocks of actually just going through their entire military capacity. And that would, of course, leave the vast geographical territory of Russia in real vulnerability to a potential invasion or secession of some sort of certain parts of their, what is de facto an empire, which is what Russia is basically. So I am, as you can see, very enthusiastic today. We also had, just as an aside here in Ukraine, obviously you heard the comments by the US President Donald Trump. Whether that really means that he is going to help Ukraine in its defensive effort with actually something tangible like more military equipment, although he has said they will sell weapons to NATO, NATO will give them here to the Ukrainian military. Whether that actually comes to fruition or not, the change in rhetoric has buoyed the morale in this country, and now things are looking, his perspective for Ukrainians is that they can succeed in their war aims, which is taking back all of de jure Ukrainian territory. That does not mean that they're aiming to take it all militarily. It could be a situation like we saw in Nagorno-Karabakh, that eventually Azerbaijan, okay, they basically took parts of it back militarily, and then they basically negotiated that those Armenians would leave, and then they were able to take back the de jure territory of the country. This is something that now seems, at least in the minds of people, again, back on the cards over the long term. So people here are super enthusiastic, and there will be huge schadenfreude over the winter, considering how much pain the Ukrainian people have suffered, in particular Russia trying to knock out the energy infrastructure in the winter. I remember back in the winter of 2022 how many times the electricity would go out, wouldn't be able to take a shower, and that was the best attempts by the Russian military to knock out the civilian infrastructure here. It did not work. Ukraine figured out enough workarounds to keep the lights on, so to speak. And yeah, maybe Russia is going to be faced with that. Large parts of the Russian territory are going to be faced with those issues going into the winter of 2025/2026. So it will be really interesting to see. We have definitely turned a corner in this war from Ukraine's point of view. Russia is now starting to face the issues that they were leading up to with this military strategy that they have. It seems that the Russian leadership is still committed to outlasting Ukraine and their Western allies. But let's see what happens going forward into 2025/2026. I am definitely the most optimistic that I have been in the last 2 years now, as we go into this new winter, that we will have a lot brighter 2026 from the Ukrainian point of view, and there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Drop your comments down below and your questions about the economic situation in Russia. I also watch Konstantin from Inside Russia. I think he's a former economist, or he is an economist, I guess, still, and he gives some interesting insights into the economic situation in Russia itself from outside the country. And we're not going to get full transparent information from Russia, that's clear, because of the nature of its government. It's a dictatorship that relies to a certain extent on not being transparent or to stay in power, right? They're not going to tell people everything's about to collapse if they want to cling on to power in Moscow. So reading between the lines, things look very good. Believe in the Ukrainian cause. Slava Ukraini. Slava do перемоги.